Okay, now we are on page 6 of the purchase contract, and now we're going to talk about seller disclosures. So section I-1 talks about the seller's disclosure statement. And this first box here is the seller's obligation to disclose, and this is the period of time that the seller has from acceptance to deliver a disclosure statement to the buyer. Obviously, if you leave this box blank, it's going to be an automatic 10 days from acceptance date. We don't want to make this date too long because depending on how long your escrow is, the buyer is going to want to have this disclosure statement ahead of time before they even do the inspection. It's always nice to have that to give to a home inspector in case there's anything within the disclosure that, if there was any kind of plumbing issues or anything that might have been done to the house, where the home inspector can double check that it was done properly, or that it's not still leaking. Maybe if there was some leaky faucet or something, the home inspector can double check that it was done properly. So again, this is the period of time that the seller has to deliver to buyer the seller's disclosure statement. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happens when the buyer gets the disclosure statement. There is a period of time that the buyer has to review and approve this disclosure. So before we get to that part, we're going to talk about I-2, which is the seller's obligation to disclose later discovered information. So let's say you're in escrow for 2 weeks, you've already gotten the disclosure statement and everything looks really good and you're moving along, and all of a sudden there is a huge plumbing issue that has come about in the house. And obviously buyer's already done the inspections, not inside the house. The seller obviously knows that there's some sort of leak under the faucet or something like that, and now realizes something new has happened since the buyer came in and did their inspection. And obviously something new has happened before he's actually closed on the property. The seller would then need to disclose that to the buyer. Now, how the seller does that is by providing what they call an update to the disclosure. And it's just a simple form basically saying update to the disclosure. On this date, this happened, and this was the remedy, and it was repaired and whatnot. And then that would be delivered to the buyer. This next box here talks about how long the seller has to get that updated disclosure to the buyer. And the buyer would then have another opportunity to review and approve. Things that would be considered update to the disclosure could be a termite inspection, survey, title report. But once those things are delivered to the buyer, it's already been delivered. So these things open up this this time frame, another time frame for the buyer to review and approve, but they wouldn't need this 3 days because once the survey is delivered, it's delivered. You don't need to worry about this 3 days. But they will mention that in here, that things like a termite inspection, survey report, see here it says inspection report, survey report, termite. These are things that would be considered updates to the disclosure, but you would not need to worry about the time frame to deliver them because once you have a survey, you're going to deliver it to the buyer, and inspections and that sort of thing. Okay, so these are the two things that you would need to fill in with reference to a seller disclosing. This next section we talk about seller's disclosure is not a warranty. Obviously, this is just something that's automatically written in here to remind the buyer that the seller's disclosure is not a warranty. That although the seller is saying, things were repaired and things were done to the house, that they are not considered a warranty on the home, and it's just a disclosure. I-4 has to do with the buyer. This first box here is how many days that the buyer has to acknowledge the receipt of either a seller disclosure statement or an amended disclosure. So if, let's say, for example, you are representing a buyer and the seller has delivered a seller's disclosure statement, you will have 3 days, and there's a form that you will receive with the disclosure, which is called a receipt of disclosure. And you'll have 3 days to get that signed and sent over to escrow. If the seller provides an update to the disclosure or an amended disclosure, then you would have the same period of time to acknowledge receipt of that update or amended disclosure. So this would apply to a regular disclosure statement, the normal one, and then any update or amended disclosure. Okay, then we go on to letter B, which is upon receipt of the disclosure statement or amended disclosure, buyer shall have 5 days to examine the disclosure statement or an amended disclosure statement. So again, it applies to both a seller's disclosure, which is about 4 pages, and then any update or amended disclosure later on. If you do receive something like that, you'd have 5 days to review and approve. And then, of course, this is a huge cancellation provision. So if something comes up in the disclosure that is a deal breaker, you can open up a period of time where you can rescind the contract or negotiate further. Okay, so again, this has to do with a regular disclosure statement and an update to the disclosure. Okay, now we're going to talk about buyer's rights and obligations upon later discovered inaccurate information. This is a little bit different than the other sections that talk about update to the disclosure or amended disclosure, but this has more to do with erroneous information or non-disclosure in the actual disclosure statement. Once the buyer has received the disclosure statement, you're going to go through it and make sure that it was filled out correctly and that anything that may have been checked in the yes column would be explained in a different section. So I'm going to kind of go over that real quick here. Here's a disclosure statement, and you'll notice like on the first page you've got a section here that talks about defects or repairs, and then numbered 1 through 33, that if anything is checked in this area, that you would want to have the seller describe it in this section, in section H, which is the last page of the disclosure. So again, you'll see things here that are checked yes, that they need to be described in section H. So as a buyer's agent, you'd want to go through this very meticulously and make sure that all of the boxes are checked, and that anything that has a yes check will need to be numbered and described here. A lot of times when a seller is filling this out, it's very comprehensive and they tend to miss things. If they do miss anything, it's considered an inaccurate information. Also, if there are boxes that are missed and not checked, that could be considered non-disclosure. So as we go through here and you see the check boxes here, maybe the seller has missed a box or possibly may have checked a box by accident and maybe meant to say yes instead of no, that type of thing. You're going to want to question that and give it back to the seller and say, look, we've noticed these inaccurate check boxes or things that weren't checked. Please make sure that you do send us a completed copy. Once you send that back to the seller would then have the opportunity to do a correction to the seller's disclosure or send you an update with all of the new, I guess, corrected information. So what this talks about here is that no matter what, the buyer has up to 15 days to rescind the contract. Well, not no matter what, but let's say, for example, the seller does provide a update to the disclosure with the corrected information, then the buyer would have 3 days to basically 3 days from receipt of that disclosure to rescind the contract. So that's kind of like why we make it really short, because we don't want to make it too long, because then the seller might, feel like that opens up his liability to a long period of time. When they see a low number like this, they might feel a little bit more comfortable that if should something happen, it isn't going to open up this huge cancellation provision, because this is another opportunity for the buyer to cancel. But if the seller doesn't get back to the buyer with any updates with corrected information, then the time frame becomes 15 days. So it's either going to be 15 days or 3 days, depending on whether or not the seller actually does the update and discloses properly, or if he does provide you with a update with the corrected information, then you would have 3 days from that point in time. But no matter what, the buyer will definitely have an opportunity to reevaluate what has been given to them and cancel the transaction should that be what they decide to do. Okay, I know it can be a little confusing, so you might want to just kind of read over it again and again just until you get it, but that's pretty much what that section talks about. All right, so now we've got I-6 through I-8, I like to talk about the basics of the contract, filling out the blanks, what needs to be put into those blanks, and anything that doesn't require that would just, you need to go through this and actually read it really good. And if there's something that you have a question about, you're welcome to contact myself or Karen. But that concludes the seller's disclosure, page 6 of the purchase contract.